Hey everybody, welcome back for another Tesol lesson. Today is just going to be a short lesson, but short but sweet, focusing on language acquisition, the learning environment. Specifically, I'll be talking about what is known as the affective filter, and I'm going to jump right on into that. This is a hypothesis developed by Krashen. And the affective filter basically determines how much a person's going to learn in a learning situation, whether formal or informal. Now, it's comprised or it's made up of attitudes toward the language. It's made up of the learner's motivation. Maybe it's internal or external. Their self-confidence and anxiety. I think self-confidence and anxiety are very similar when it comes to a language learning setting. But I do want to focus on the attitudes, the confidence of the learner, and the anxiety in this particular lesson. And again, this is just going to be a short lesson, something to kind of get your mind thinking about the environment of your learners. It's one thing to have a wonderful lesson prepared and present it in your mind very well. Wonderful materials, wonderful visual aids. You think the topic is really good, but in the end, the students didn't learn much at all because maybe A, they have a bad attitude toward English. B, they just lack the confidence and they're maybe afraid you're going to call on them. Or related to that would be maybe anxiety. Maybe they're just extremely nervous in your class. So the end result is they're going to have what is called a high affective filter, which is going to decrease the overall learning process of that language learner. What we want to focus on or target as language teachers is a low affective filter, which is going to actually facilitate increased learning. Now let's have a look at that very briefly. A low anxiety environment is one where the hypothetical affective filter, which is of course in the mind, again, Krashen hypothesized that there is a kind of filter that either allows input fully in or decreases the input, as in the high affective filter. You can see the high affective filter and a low affective filter. I like to again focus on the anxiety. So a low anxiety learning environment or a high anxiety learning environment is going to pretty much affect or have an overall impact on how well that learner is going to receive the learning or the lesson for that time in the class. So let's just very briefly go through the process, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions maybe to get you to think how we might affect this, or how we might cause or create low anxiety or cause high anxiety. So let's start with the input. Now, if you remember from a previous lesson, input can be pretty much anything. But in our case, it's the classroom, it's the quote-unquote lesson that we're providing. So that's going to be the input. It can be oral, it can be through text, it can be visual. The idea is there's some kind of language input. Now, if the student's feeling comfortable in your class, if they're maybe not too hungry, or maybe the temperature of the class is enjoyable, maybe the chemistry between the class members is good, the teacher is kind, the teacher is sympathetic, the teacher is nice, perhaps the teacher is speaking in a slower rate of speed, using high frequency vocabulary that the learners learn, There's all kinds of combinations here that can help to create a low anxiety learning environment. Now, as you go through the class, the learner's attentive, the learner's enjoying themselves, that anxiety or that affective filter is really decreased because there's a low anxiety with those learners or with that particular learner. So we'll focus on the individual. And as that occurs, very little resistance to the input, and so it goes into what Chomsky calls the language acquisition device, which he theorized is in everybody's brain, and it helps everyone to pretty much understand the structure of the language. It's focusing more on the grammatical aspect, how to put the language together, and then work through it and understand the ideas of the code, the technical aspects of the code. Now it goes into this language acquisition device, and then when the learner at some point in the future, not necessarily in your class, but at some point, the learner is able to access that information and use it in what is called the monitor. This is also part of Krashen's monitor hypothesis. And he hypothesized that everyone has, in addition to a LAD, a monitor which helps people construct sentences or statements. And in this case, it's more on speaking. So you might get some learners who are kind of low fluency speakers. What could be the case is they're actually overusing that monitor, trying to put together the perfect sentence. Now that could be any number of reasons. It could be cultural, because they want to do well, or they want to save face. They don't want to be embarrassed by putting together a statement that doesn't make sense. Or it could have something to do with the psychology of it, that they've been traumatized by perhaps a terrible teacher who maybe overcorrected them at some point in the past, maybe even embarrassed them in class to the point that they're overly cautious. Now the monitor is something that's going to affect fluency, but that's a different lesson at this point. I want to only focus right now on the affective filter and the input. So the learner is able to access what he or she learned in your lesson that went through a low affective filter that made its way into the LAD and is there, and it is processed and it's retained, and now the learner is putting together a statement that they want to use, and it's related to the input they receive. And so the output is going to be, let's say, successful output, meaning that what they learned in your class made its way in, and they are now able to use it. Now, if you multiply that times 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 400, 600 hours of language learning in a low anxiety environment, probably that learner is going to be more capable of providing more intelligible or understandable output. Now, let's look at a high anxiety environment, and I'm going to erase all of that for now. Let's go back to the high anxiety learning environment. Now, let's say, same scenario, you have a lesson prepared. You have a class of students. Let's just say that they're high school students, because they're really the embarrassed group. They're really shy with one another. So already they have some anxiety. Another reason for the anxiety could be that they have had a lot of traumatic experience in previous English classes. They've never taken your class before, because you're a great communicative teacher, but already they have this high affective filter because they maybe feel some apprehension in any English class because maybe in the past they've been embarrassed, they've gotten the wrong answers. The traditional teacher says wrong, right, pass, fail, black and white. And so maybe your face or your stature reminds them of this teacher. Maybe they're with someone in the class that they don't particularly care for. Maybe, as I mentioned, they just don't like English. So what's going to happen in that situation is that affective filter is actually going to grow or increase, which you can see the effect of an affective filter increase. More anxiety is going to actually decrease the learning. Now I'm going to go off on a tangent. Sometimes it's not your fault. Maybe the students are hungry. Maybe they had a fight with someone close to them. Maybe something you can't control is the temperature of the classroom. Maybe they had a hard time getting to school or the class today. So it could be external, but whatever the case might be, they have a little anxiety. In other words, they're not quite focused on the lesson. They're not. They have kind of a shield, basically, and we'll call that the affective filter. So you have this wonderful lesson, great visual aids. It might even be a little interesting for them. It might be very interesting for your learners. However, those who might have a high anxiety or a high affective filter could very well be missing the whole idea of your lesson. So what happens is very little is going to get in to the lad. Very little is going to be accessed when the time comes that they need information from that particular lesson because it's really not accessible because not much got in. There's nothing there to get. And so what happens in the end, the output is not as ideal as it could have been if the input were there and accessible. So I know that's kind of a simplified way. If you've read and studied Krashen's monitor hypothesis, and then the 5 hypotheses, you'll know probably a little more detail than what I'm giving. I'm just really simplifying it. I'm all about keeping things simple. Language teachers don't need to know all of the details of every theory and all of this technical stuff. But what we do need to know is the practical information. I'm not discounting the theory. A good teacher knows that they're not perfect. A good teacher is going to study and review. But what I'm saying is just where the rubber meets the road, where teachers are in the class, what do they need to know to hit the ground running? And that's what I'm really discussing at this point. So you might have some comments, or you might say that I'm missing something, or I'm not hitting the mark in your eyes or from your perspective. But the idea is to get the information out there in a short time. Now let's go back to the low anxiety or the low affective filter learning environment. I'd like to ask the question, and of course I can't hear you, but you're very welcome to leave comments. What teacher behaviors are going to help create a low anxiety learning environment? Now I did mention previously or earlier, not previously, but earlier I did mention a few things. Perhaps the teacher is smiling. Perhaps the teacher is kind. Teacher is sympathetic. The teacher knows how to kind of break up the ice between the learners. The lesson is interesting. The lesson is relevant. It's comprehensible. And the learners have a good feeling about English because they've been with you in this kind of environment for a long time now. So those are behaviors that could help create a low anxiety learning environment. Maybe you can think of some others. I've only given general ideas. But the idea is think about how you can make your environment low anxiety. Because the idea, guys, is no matter how wonderful your input is, if this affective filter is high, not much is going to get in. The student basically is not paying attention or is not focusing on your lesson. The eyes are there. We have an expression in among teachers, right? Physically present but mentally absent. So maybe their mind is thinking about something else. You've got to get their mind on the lesson. You've got to put them at ease and get that anxiety down or that affective filter lower. So again, what teacher behaviors help to create a low anxiety learning environment? I would challenge you to think of those and even write them down or observe your classes. What works, what doesn't work. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, what teacher behaviors could cause a high anxiety learning environment? One could very well be the traditional teaching methods, the traditional teacher, the boss, the king or queen of the classroom. It could be a poor chemistry between your language learners. It could be a lesson that's just very uninteresting. It could be some activity that you are imposing upon your learners that they really don't want to do. Sometimes I think because we read a lot of materials, maybe we read an article, and for example, teenagers like to sing, just for example only, like to sing, and we go to the classroom, we try to apply that, and it doesn't work. Well, that's because there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Only you really are going to understand and know your class. The people who write the articles, they're going on generalities, but you know your class, hopefully, better than anyone else. My opinion and experience, singing doesn't always work well with young learners, such as teenagers or even adults. Games don't always work with certain groups of adults and teenagers. Why? Because they're so concerned about peer pressure and how they are appearing to peers and to their classmates. You have to think about that. And so maybe that's something that's causing a high affective filter. The students are thinking, oh no, this is not a good activity. So they're just going through the motions, but they're not getting the input, as you can see here. Let me erase that. They're not getting the full input. And in the future, when they go to use it, it's not there. And so you can't blame your learners for not remembering or being able to access a lesson that you've given before, because maybe at the time they weren't into it, or maybe at the time you had created an environment where many of the learners had a high affective filter. So I'm going to stop at this point. Remember, just to review, we're talking about the learning environment. We looked at affective filter hypothesis, very generally, briefly speaking, by Krashen, Stephen Krashen. I call him the grandfather of language acquisition, SLA. He's been doing it for a long time, and I still subscribe to his theories because they're good foundational theories. This affective filter has really served me well throughout my learning and teaching career. So we looked at the low and high filters. Now remember, the affective filter can be related to motivation, can be related to attitude, confidence, and anxiety. I chose more to focus on anxiety than any other aspect, simply because that's something that teachers can relatively control in the class. We looked at the low affective filter and what that means as far as getting input in and being able to use it in the future. And we also looked at the high anxiety or the high affective filter learning environment. Think about what you can do to create a low anxiety learning environment for your learners, because it'll give the results you might be looking for, and other people, and your learners themselves. And think about what behaviors you might be doing that actually creates a high affective filter. So that's all for now. Have a great class.